I hope it is visible. I'm just putting on the slideshow.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
it visible?
yeah, yeah. It is
Okay.
perfectly okay. Okay, please carry
Okay.
on. Please start the session.
Yes.
Thank you.
So very good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you again after our previous lecture on water. We discussed status and distribution in that. So now our next part of the lecture concerns water quality, categories and competitive uses. So just to give a brief introduction about what we are going to learn. Again, I'd like to go through what important point we are addressing here is the ecological and the physiochemical status of water with respect to its quality and competitive uses, considering these water resources and considering their interrelationships with the biological organisms. So, moving on, this very slide is very important for us to understand. We actually discussed a lot about distribution, and we also discussed about the different sectors which make demands on water resources. So that we did last class. If you will recall, we categorized them as demands from agricultural sector, domestic sector, industrial sector, and other sectors, right? So these four types of major types of consumptive uses we thought about. But there is something that we have to think about when water itself, apart from the way it is globally distributed, if we take it as a finite resource, okay, we usually consider water as an infinite resource, which is not true. It is also finite on the surface of earth. So if we consider, for example, a river, a canal, a tank or a lake, these are all finite resources. So these are structurally more consistent than they are more dynamic. What I mean is the dynamicity of these ecosystems, they arise due to several factors. Those factors we attribute to what we call as water quality. These are non-linear in their status, which means that they are liable to change at any point in time. So we have to understand that the systems are first of all finite and they are dynamic. So now our problem starts with what is the capacity of these finite resources on which several uses or demands are being made. So this is the basic concept of what we know as competitive use. Competitive use means what is the renewable water available and what is the ground recharge available and what is the surface water available in terms of rivers, lakes, riparian areas or wetlands, and how through their use or through their flow per sector makes its demand. So what is known as water abstraction? Water abstraction is a term which means that how much of water is taken away from this finite source of renewable or there is actually a very interesting thing. We call it finite, but we call it renewable. Both are correct. So you can have a confusion why I'm calling it finite, but still it is renewable. It is renewable because, as we have seen in the other class, there is a hydrological cycle in place which transforms water from one state to another and keeps replenishing it. But the rate at which replenishing takes place is quite different from the rate at which abstraction takes place. So which brings us to the problem of water abstraction. That means drawing of water. So capacity is one thing when we think about competitive use, another is flow or abstraction. So for example, what are the actual things which can have a water demand on a competitive basis? Competitive is because at the same time, several sectors draw water. What are those? The public or the domestic sector, the industrial sector, the hydropower sector, the irrigation sector, as well as livestock. All these require water at the same time for a given place. In a given place, the amount of groundwater and surface water is utilized by these competitive users. Also, we think of something known as nitrogen retention or nitrogen removal from water. Why is this necessary? I would like you to remember this because we are going to talk about what are known as water quality characteristics in the further slides. We will come to it, but this is a very important characteristic again when we talk about flow. And capacity and flow dictates how competitively users benefit from the availability of water. But benefit itself comes with certain characteristics. For example, what is the cost of water per sector? Do you think that it will be the same for domestic and industrial sectors? No. So it's definitely there is going to be a difference. So what is the cost of water drawal or water abstraction per sector? This also defines how each sector is benefited by the use of water. Also, it doesn't stop with just abstraction. It also stops with reuse. Reuse can only happen if it is first use and then reuse. So use part requires treatment. It may be primary, secondary, tertiary, based on at what level the water needs to be refined. For other part, that is the reuse part, again the water that comes after the use from these competitive users, that needs to be brought back to some sort of a status which from where it can be used again. So that is the concept between reuse. But each of these have costs which add to the total benefit or the summative benefits. So when we are thinking about competitive uses, we classify water systems based on their capacity, their flow, and their benefits. But all these factors together is what dictate the sustainability component also. So in this, as is shown in this diagram, you can see there are two different indices. One is what is known as the water exploitation index, which is the water that is consumed as a fraction of the available water. We saw the different types of water availability over different classes last class. So now you can appreciate what is the consumption per sector, which also is dependent on how the water is abstracted. So we term this as exploitation because we are trying to use whatever is available on the surface or the ground for the different sectors or human use basically. So this competitive use is also indicative what is the efficiency of nitrogen retention. So why is nitrogen important? We will be looking at this. What we understand now is that the functional characteristics of the water use or water's competitive use depend on capacity or the potential of the ecosystem to deliver the services, flow or the direction of flow of action and implementation, or it also denotes the actual use of the ecosystem service. In this case, it is the aquatic ecosystem. And benefits equal the human well-being and the value systems, knowledge integration and exchange. These impact how the services are utilized. So indicators of this aquatic ecosystem services, very importantly, are dealt within two heads. One head is water provisioning. We saw water abstraction, we saw water exploitation, and we saw competitive use. So water provisioning is the central concept which governs all these together. If there is a very good water provisioning system in place, it means that the exploitation index will be low. It also means that the water abstraction per sector is balanced by water which is recharged into the ground or reused. Okay, so this is a very important factor. The second factor is water purification. If you remember, we discussed the distribution as well as quality as two big problems which concern the aquatic ecosystems, which also lead to dictate the sustainability characteristics in the last class. So exactly bringing it down, it's concerning water provisioning and water purification. Purification relies on restoring the quality which had deteriorated over time. So moving on, ecosystem services. We talked about ecosystem services. So we have to talk about the services of these ecosystems in terms of their quantity and quality, also in terms of their complex interactions with natural geology, the climatic scenario, the land management aspects, and anthropogenic modification of these landscapes. Each of them will have an effect on how overall the aquatic ecosystem services are used. Like I said, is it exploited or is it balanced or is it being used in a sustainable way? So decision making in terms of competitive use requires three important considerations. First consideration is incorporation of the spatial aspect of it. By spatial, we mean what is the location of the water resource and how wide and far these ecosystem services can be used to the best possible extent. Second is the capacity to predict the effects of the current land use and land resources management aspects. So that is also important so that there is the loss of water is very much minimized. And finally, considering something which is likely beyond our control, unless we take effective management strategies to cope with this, I mean the climate change scenarios. So forecasting and monitoring the climate change scenarios as a product of time, as a product of management aspects is also one of the key factor which will help us to make the proper decisions regarding the use of ecosystem services for aquatic ecosystems. So in this slide very nicely summarizes what we have just discussed. Here you see there are three columns in between. This shows the integrated assessment framework. So the first column is that of the pressures or the actual anthropogenic stresses that is laid on the water resources itself. The second box shows, which is in green, shows the ecosystem status whenever the stable states of the water resources are altered. And finally, you see it comes down to the use of the ecosystem services. So now let us go one by one. If you see, there are something known as drivers. Drivers, examples are population, land use changes, the economic activities that are carried on. Example is agriculture, industry, mining, all the things which stress or use the resources. Also, consumption pattern of water itself and climate change. So all these boil down to how competitively water resources are used. This leads to pressures which are dealt with in different ways. For example, man has to store rainwater. So humans build dams and they use wells to abstract the water. So these are putting a lot of pressure, not just as I said on the water resources, but also on the local geology, the local climate scenario, as well as how these are consumed over time. Another pressure which appears due to land use change, if you see, is the pollution aspect. It can be diffuse pollution or it can be point pollution. Diffuse pollution is also known as non-point source pollution. That is, pollutants can enter water at definite areas or where there can be multiple entries where it can just flow as a part of the maximum flow accumulation or flow patterns. Okay. So let us take the example of a lake or a lagoon system as we saw the other day. We can also call it a watershed. That will give a better perspective if we take it as a watershed. The watershed can have finite points where the water enters. One finite point is the river inlet. That is, we can all guess and assume that this is a point source through which water enters this system. What are the other ways in which water can enter? Those can be through industrial outlets, industries which let out the wastewater from their treatment into the water bodies. Another point source is how the thermal pollution, thermal waters, if there is, say, a thermal power plant situated nearby or a nuclear power plant situated nearby, they use water as coolants. So the water quality does not deteriorate, but the heat capacity or the heat characteristics of water that changes. So that water is a thermal pollutant which can enter another water body. So these are point pollutants. There can also be diffuse pollution, which means that the agricultural lands which surround a lake system, for example, water from these agricultural fields can enter very periodically or non-periodically into the lake at several entries, at several points or several inlets. So these inlets are diffuse in nature. That is, today it can be present, tomorrow it may not be present. It can be present at a different place from what it was present today. So these inlets are diffuse inlets. They are non-point sources. So these are the two ways in which pollutants as well as other factors which can deteriorate the water quality can enter an aquatic ecosystem. This is a product of the land use change itself. So, for example, if there's an agricultural field, the pollutants that enter through the runoff are different. If it, rather, if there are more industries surrounding, then it is a different scenario. Also, other activities such as mining activities and then agricultural activities, these will also add what are known as salts, or they will corrupt the water groundwater characteristics to such an extent that the salt concentration in the waters increase through seepage. We have seen through base flow, seepage and infiltration what happens, and that also correspond to how the water quality of a given water ecosystem will change over time. So the consumption patterns, such as if there is overfishing in a place, or if there are alien species or non-native species of plants or animals or fishes entering into the ecosystem, all these also put pressure on the aquatic ecosystems. Finally, as I said, the change in the climate itself, that is a less understood event, but because it's mostly because we don't feel it in a very short span of time. Sometimes it is felt in very short spans of times, but not always. So we tend to overlook the changes over long periods of time, but it is still a big pressure on the ecosystem and a very significant one. So in response to this, what ecosystem characteristics such as quantity, quality, the biotic elements, as well as the hydromorphology change over time. These are the factors which will tell us how the water ecosystem has changed. The parameters which indicate this are water flow, groundwater recharge, the nutrient concentrations. Now we come to N, P and SI. So I'd like to tell you there is a particular ratio in nature called Redfield ratio, which has to be maintained. That is, carbon is to nitrogen is to phosphorus is to silicate. Okay, so this nitrogen has to be 16 is to 1, or 106 is to 16 is to 1. This is the ratio in which carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus are usually found in nature. If there is an alteration to this, it means that it can make the system, as we had seen the other day, from oligotrophic to mesotrophic to eutrophic. So the change in the stoichiometry, it is called, that is the ratio of nitrogen is to phosphorus, can cause great changes to how the water quality is seen over time. For example, if there are nitrogenous fertilizers which come in the runoff, they are going to increase the nitrate concentration and make it unsuitable for biotic life to live. When this happens, the water quality deteriorates, and the competitive users of that particular resource is actually more stressed than it was at stable state. Another example is the presence of algal blooms. The increase in the chlorophyll concentrations, the increase in the macroinvertebrates or the small, a natural floodplain where water is accumulating. If that floodplain is lost, as I told you, because of human pressure, it is also going to change. And the water characteristics itself, from the habitat perspective, that will also change. So there is a change in the hydromorphological structure. Now we have understood this, linking this to ecosystem services, as we had discussed capacity, flow, and benefits. What it means is these are all non-drinking sectors. So water provisioning for them will be different. and it will be different in terms of those for which consumptive water is done. For example, human food is also important characteristics to understand, while ecosystem services are determined in terms of flow or benefit. Finally, there's something called carbon sequestration, as you see. So carbon, as I say again, the stoichiometry has to be maintained. Carbon has to be present in certain quantities. Only then the presence of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in that specific stoichiometry helps the elements to be bioavailable to organisms, and also for further abiotic processing. So carbon sequestration is also very, very important part. Mangroves contribute a lot to this. The presence or absence of mangroves or wetlands, if you see, which are also associated aquatic ecosystems, these are very, very important in maintaining the ecosystem services for water. Finally, though water also has a recreational value. So we have a specific ecosystem service which can be attributed to the recreational part of it also. So we have to provision water from that aspect also. So if we put all this together in an overview, three important things stand out as we already determined. First is we have to think about water provisioning in terms of availability and distribution. Number two, in terms of its quality and consumption. And number three, in terms of its competitive use and sustainability. So these are the ways in which competitive uses for water versus water provisioning should be drawn. So briefly, we are coming to the aspect which will determine how competitive use is maintained, balanced, and used over sustainably or accepted scales, so that the ecosystem restoration is possible at the same time water is put to sustainable use. So both aspects are important. First thing is that in this figure, this is a very, very nice figure. If you see, it shows there are 10 principles which underpin ecosystem restoration. So we are definitely, one thing we have to accept is that through our use or drawal of water from aquatic resources or aquatic ecosystems, we are going to deteriorate it. And it is our responsibility to restore it hence. So what are the principles? The first principle you see deals with global contribution. Okay. So this is not a very easily achievable target. Contribution, but monitoring management at local levels should be how sustainable use and restoration be balanced. So if we need to put competitive use in front of us, there is also the equal need to maintain the water quality or water fulfillment without compromising on the water quality. So moving on, what are the factors that we call as water quality? What contribute to it? So there is a physical part, there is a chemical part, and there is a biological part to water, as we saw. So the physical parameters which give the water its quality are temperature, that is water temperature, total suspended solids, turbidity, odor, taste, and flow. These are the physical parameters which are concerned with water quality. So how do we test the water quality? That is very, very important. Like we saw, monitoring is a very, very important approach. To monitor means to test, to evaluate, and to assess at periodic intervals what is the change in the water quality. In that sense, we have to first determine, we go one by one of these parameters within testing at the ecosystem itself. So if it is a river, we test at the river site itself. If it's a lake, we test the water at the lake site itself. So that is in situ, where the water is flowing. We put the thermometer at that flow and test. So this is how testing for temperature is done. Odor should be done. Usually testing of water involves sample collection. So odor should be done there itself, in situ or at the place itself, within 5 minutes of sample collection. And taste, very comically, you can do this at your own risk, but this is also being done in terms of the water treatment plant. taste is one of the important factors by which we can recognize what is the quality of water, which we regularly do. So the next factor is total suspended solids. So total suspended solids is, by its name you can understand how much of solids are suspended in the water. So what are the solids? It can be leaves, it can be litter, it can be plastic, it can be biodegradable and non-biodegradable. All these are suspended in the water. But mostly the suspended solids are mostly the agglomerated solids which can be filtered off. So there is mud or particles of clay, sand, these which can be filtered, they are known as total suspended solids. When water is filtered, the residue from that filter is dried and it is weighed. Then it is compared to the weight of the filter without these residue. Then we can get what is the actual amount of total suspended solids which are present in the given water. This is simple. But how do we measure turbidity? See, these two are linked parameters. On one hand, suspended solids, they will cause, why is turbidity an important factor? First of all, we need to have a feel of it. Turbidity refers to the amount of transparency of the water column. Okay, this is linked to the amount of light that is scattered by the water sample, which means that if it is more turbid, there are more solids present in that. It can be suspended solids or it can be dissolved solids. We have to understand that. But the light scattering property is a physical property. So we consider turbidity as a physical parameter. As you can see here, there are different conical flasks to which some chemicals are added, which indicate the level of turbidity of water samples. The one on your right hand side, if you see the rightmost extreme, it is 10, or it's called Nephalometric turbidity units. There is a unit called Nephalometric turbidity units, NTU. The NTU of 10 is more clear water compared to the 4000 NTU water, which is to your extreme left. And you can see gradations of these in between. So you can take a water sample, filter it, remove the suspended solids, then you test for turbidity. So that will indicate how actual turbidity or how much of light the water can scatter. The last parameter, physical parameter we'll discuss today is what is known as flow. So how is flow calculated? Why is first flow important? Flow is important because it is related. First thing we have to understand, each parameter is interrelated with another parameter. If the flow is higher, turbidity could be low. Suspended solids, we don't know, maybe high or low. Dissolved solids are likely to be low because when the water is retained for a long time, more dissolution happens. If it's not retained for a long time, then the dissolution of the rocks surrounding the flowing water system, that can contribute to the total dissolved or total suspended solid concentration. But it will still be lesser compared to the water which is present in lakes, right? Which are where the water retention is for a greater time. So flow gauging is interconnected to different other aspects. One aspect is turbidity, another aspect is dissolved solids, another aspect is suspended solid. So water, river, as you can see, this is done during a field analysis. A typical field analysis looks like this. It is planned in such a way that there are something called as flow meters. In a boat, a person takes a subsection of the river and travels from one bank to another bank and measures the width, the velocity, and the depth. So we have a formula which says area is equal to depth into width, which we can calculate, and then discharge is calculated as a product of area versus the velocity of the flow. So the river section which contributes to the flow is measured at each section. Impeller is an instrument that is used which denotes the velocity of flow, and the reading for each section, they are added together to produce the reading for the whole river. So this is how flow gauging is done. To summarize the parameters and their units, the first parameter we saw is the temperature. The temperature is expressed in the form of degrees Celsius. The total suspended solids are measured and are reported in the form of parts per million. How much of solids is present in parts per million? Turbidity is measured as NTU or Nephalometric turbidity units. Odor is a qualitative parameter. It's subjective. Also, so is the taste. And flow gauging is measured in terms of meter cubes of the water which flows per second. So now we are moving on to the next set of very important parameters. These are the chemical parameters. So what are the most important chemical parameters? The first one is what is known as pH. Another is dissolved oxygen. The next is called specific conductance or electrical conductivity. The next is called as alkalinity, and the rest are the concentrations of nutrients, especially in the dissolved form as dissolved nitrates and dissolved phosphates. So these are very, very important parameters which help us to assess the ambient status and also to characterize the water for normal or treated use. So characterization starts with the chemical parameter analysis. So as I said, first water is collected as sample from different points. Some and non-point sources entry is happening into the water system. We can collect water during a field survey from several points like this to test the ambient status at different parts of the ecosystem. Also, there are other factors or chemicals which are present in small concentration but will still rather affect the quality. Those are the presence or the concentrations of heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, industrial wastes, pharmaceutical wastes, and surfactants. So these are also chemicals which influence the chemical quality of water. They also are used to denote if the water is an effluent. Effluent means it has been used in some process and then it has been let out. That is the effluent. So is it an effluent, and can we characterize it as on the basis of the treatment to which it is subjected? Has it been subjected to secondary treatment which removes most of the solids from the water, or has it been subjected to tertiary or more advanced treatment where the parameter called dissolved oxygen has also been restored? So we are going to look at these things. So first let us go one by one. The first parameter is pH, as I told you. pH is generally known as we all know from our high school chemistry, it is the negative logarithm of hydrogen ion concentration, and it is tested using either reagents in the lab or mostly using what are known as calibrated electronic meters. Those are known as pH meters. So we know that if the pH is 7, it is a neutral pH. It denotes the neutral status of water. A pH more than 7 will denote alkaline characteristics of water, whereas that below 7 up to moving up to 0 will denote an acidic characteristic for water. So why is this important? By definition, I told you, pH is a measure of the negative logarithm of hydrogen ion concentration. So it's a measure of either it is acidic, alkaline, or neutral. So the significance is that each of these ranges are very important in terms of tolerance for aquatic life to live in the water. So the basic and the most comfortable range, if you will call, is 6 to 8. If acid deposition is there in the water, for example, it will impact the acidity part of the water and increase it. So if pH falls below 6, as you can see in this diagram, first when it falls to up to 5, mosses and harmful algae, there will be organisms which will die, the useful algae die, and the harmful algae will start to dominate. If it goes beyond 4, that is, it drops to 4, then there will be massive fish kill. Fish cannot tolerate a pH below 5 basically. And then when it goes below that, basically most life is absent. In that ways, it also starts to release metals or toxic elements from the sediments. So the interaction of water and sediments is continuous. So if water gets polluted, you can see that the sediments also will get polluted under acidic conditions to release more toxic chemicals into the water. So what happens on the other end of the spectrum? If the pH rises to about 9, it also causes damages to the organisms itself. So it causes damage to the gills of the fishes, the eyes of the fishes, and their skin. If it goes about 10, there is an inability to dispose any toxic waste. So it gets the toxic wastes remain. They cannot be recycled, as we say, into through normal biogeochemical cycling patterns. They just remain in the water ecosystem as such, and they cannot be disposed. And beyond 11, the toxic ammonia sets in into the water. The concentration of ammonia in the water starts to increase, which will all again lead to disappearance of aquatic life. So our ambient concentration about 6 to 8. Although it's a very short range, you see most life is supported in water in this range. So it is essential that whenever we are thinking about water quality, our first concern is it should be between 6 and 8. Second parameter is water temperature, as we have seen. Temperature we saw as a physical parameter, but I'm bringing this as a master abiotic factor which controls other parameters. Okay, so here it controls what are known as convection layers, which impact how the circulation and bioavailability of nutrients to aquatic life is dictated. So in this way, the warmer temperature will cause more dissolution of oxygen, more dissolution of nutrients, and make it more available to the biotic organism. So this is a chemical reaction which is facilitated by the water temperature. As I already mentioned, there is a strong interrelationship between these factors. The factor called temperature will influence the metabolic rate.
Ma'am, sorry, your voice is breaking.
Conductivity of water. Yes, is it okay now? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes,
are you able to
ma'am.
hear me?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that there could be some network issue here. So I just hope that nothing else disrupts the class. So moving on, we were talking about electrical conductivity. So electrical conductivity is a measure of the salinity of the water. That means if more ions are present, the water is called more saline or more in salinity. And more the salinity, the water, it is more conductive in nature, and it is measured using a probe in the field, as you can see in the picture here. So electrical conductivity is also defined in terms of what is known as total dissolved solids. So there is a specific relationship between these two parameters. Total dissolved solids as such are a combination of dissolved solids, suspended solids. So dissolved solids and suspended solids, they denote different characteristics of water. So TDS, as it is known as, we are very familiar with TDS because all of us use some sort of water purifier at home, wherein there is a categorization that the TDS should be below so and so value. So we are very familiar actually with this particular parameter. So it is a combined sum of concentration of all ionic particles which are there in dissolved state in the water. And the criteria is these particles should be less than 2 microns in size. So what can be the substances which are below 2 microns? The first one are the salts, or all the dissolved organic matter which are present in the water. So they signify how much of pollution the lake is subjected to based on the value that they show. For example, 0 to 50, the TDS is below 0 to 50, it is ideal for drinking. Again, this is the most ambient range that we can consider. If it is about 50 to 100, as it can be, this denote that the water is of the type of a lake where there is some sort of algal growth or planktonic growth happening, which will contribute to some sort of ions here if you test pH, it can be a little bit more alkaline, maybe towards 8. If it crosses 100 or it's between 100 and 200, there is medium pollution. It can denote medium level of pollution or moderate pollution. Those above 200 to 400 in terms of TDS, they can be in a natural water system. They can denote that these are mineral springs or where the concentration of salts are increased or enhanced. Still, some sort of life forms can tolerate these ranges, especially, for example, coastal lagoon ecosystems and estuaries have higher TDS ranges. That is they are between the TDS of seawater and the TDS of fresh water if you measure. So these are actually tolerable by organisms which are known as brackish water life forms. If they cross 500, then it is either a very polluted system or very polluted water sample, or it is a very hypersaline lake water, and it is not suitable for any purpose. In terms of competitive use, for example, if we say 0 to 50, the water quality or the TDS of the water is about 0 to 50, it can be used for consumptive purposes. Anything beyond 100 cannot be used for consumptive purpose. So at a time, water which can be taken, for example, if the TDS of water is 100, if it can be taken for further treatment, it can at the same time be used competitively for agriculture, industry, and treated water for consumptive purpose. So this is how water is at the same time put for different uses. But this particular chemical parameter is a very significant parameter which will dictate how the water is used competitively as well. Another very important is what is oxygen. Oxygen does not do this. If it is present in very low concentrations, you get a certain value. If it is present in a very high concentration, the DO meter gives a different value. So from that we can see that how much of charge dilution is happening corresponding to the concentration of oxygen that is present in the water. So what is very important about the DO is that the oxygen forms the life force for the aquatic organisms as it does for us. So organisms are dependent on the oxygen for their respiration. If the dissolved oxygen concentration is low, it means that it is not supportive of many life forms which depend on water as their habitats, which live in water basically. So in that sense, if a dissolved oxygen concentration of below 4 is detected, here again 4 to 8 is the ambient range. If it goes below 4, it means that the water is not suitable to support life forms. If it goes below 8, above 8, it means that there is some sort of oxidation that is happening and some sort of addition of oxygen that is happening both simultaneously, because of which the oxygen saturation has occurred. This can occur when there are specific industrial pollutants which are entering the system, or there is very high organic pollution happening in the system. So dissolved oxygen is also a very, very important indicator of the biological production as well as the ecological production of water systems. So now we are relating this to the presence of nutrients. As I said, dissolved nutrients refer to the inorganic forms of nitrates, nitrogen and phosphorus in water that is recycled from the decomposition of the organic wastes by the microorganisms present in the water. So these are very important limiting factors which affect how the productivity and growth of algae occurs in water along with carbon. So how do we deduce the status of lakes based on these concentrations? If they are of higher concentration, we can say that there is an over enrichment of nutrients. So this phenomenon is what is known as eutrophication, and this can not from the stable state but a supersaturated state, which are known as algal blooms. So the concentration of algal cells in water supersaturate, causing what are known as is a bloom condition. And excessive levels will result when there is an agricultural runoff or there is an artificial enrichment of water through different ways. For example, industrial pollution, agricultural runoff, all these can contribute to an increase in nitrates and phosphate concentrations in water. And this can cause a very tough condition for survival, because once this increases, automatically organisms consume these nutrients and they produce and reproduce and multiply, and their numbers increase. But as soon as their numbers increase, the amount of dissolved oxygen in water is finite, so that decreases because the demand is greater. If more and more dissolved oxygen is used, it falls below certain levels, and when DO falls below certain levels, the water quality or the redistribution of nutrients, both are affected. So anoxia or lack of oxygen results, and this can cause excessive, again, pollution from excessive nutrients in lake ecosystems, because there is also not a possibility to combust these nutrients in situ. The accumulation can lead to other issues in water quality. So now how do we test for these dissolved oxygens? We use a technique called spectrophotometric technique, which is the most common, but there are other sophisticated instrumentation also available. But a spectrophotometer basically uses this principle of detection in the visible wavelength, visible or UV wavelength. It's called a UV visible spectrophotometer. Water samples are taken back to the lab, as I mentioned, and specific volumes are made to react with some measured amounts of reagents, which will help to generate a color. So the change in the color is detected through a detector, as shown in this picture, and the detection is assuming that there is a light scattering based on the amount of color that is generated by the addition of chemicals to particular water samples. And this is actually proportional to the amount of dissolved nutrients which are present in the water. So this change between the original samples of the light scattering capacity and the reagent mixed waters, the difference gives the concentration of the nutrients. So to summarize the different chemical parameters and their units, pH, as we know that it has no unit. Specific conductance, it's measured as microsiemens per centimeter. That is the standard measure. So electrical conductivity is also measured as microsiemens per centimeter. TDS is measured as milligrams per liter. I'm sorry, it is not mentioned here. TDS is total dissolved solids, which is also mentioned as milligrams per liter. Nitrates and phosphates are also measured as milligrams per liter. Dissolved oxygen is reported as parts per million, and other chemical constituents as masses per volume of water, which is tested. So now we saw a great deal about competitive uses of water. So at the same time, there are different classes of water which are designated by the Central Pollution Control Board, and they have specific usages. So from that designated best use of the class, there are A, B, C, D, E, and below E categories. So the A class here, as you can see, is the class of water which can be used for consumptive purpose, that is drinking water source without conventional treatment, but after disinfection. So what should the water quality correspond to for this class of quality of waters? The quality should be that there is a unit called total coliform organism. I said that there are physical, chemical, and biological characteristics. So biological characteristics are measured from the concentration of water known as total coliform organisms. The total coliform are enteric organisms present in the water, which can cause diseases, enteric diseases, if they are present above what is known as the most probable number, or MPN. So that MPN should be less than 50 or less than 50 for it to qualify, because you cannot typically remove all coliforms in the water. There will still be left. And that is the nature of natural water, or in its ambient status. So if the total coliform MPN is 50 or less per 100 ml of water sample taken, that denotes that the water belongs to class A. Also, the pH should be between 6.5 and 8.5. The dissolved oxygen. Okay, dissolved oxygen should be 6 milligrams per liter or more. And what is another important characteristic is called the biochemical oxygen demand. That is the amount of oxygen that is measured due to the activity of the chemicals. Okay, biological and chemical activity together is measured as biochemical oxygen demand. There is a specific way in which this is measured. This denotes the biological pollution. There is another biological as well as chemical pollution. There is a very important characteristic called chemical oxygen demand that denotes if the water is subjected to some sort of industrial pollution. So the biochemical oxygen demand for 5 days, it's a 5-day affair that should be conducted at around 20 degrees C. The value should be less than 2 milligrams per liter or less. So if the water corresponds to these categories, it can be considered as class A. Similarly, there are categories such as outdoor bathing, organized category, drinking water source after conventional treatment and disinfection, propagation of wildlife and fisheries, and for irrigation or industrial purposes. So we have about 5 different important classes, and a class below E which does not meet either of these criteria and which does not have best designated use. It is just water which is not competitively used. So this is the way in which actually Central Pollution Control Board measures the different water quality and designates its use accordingly. So I have indicated some tolerance limit as per Indian Standards 1991. For water temperature, the tolerance for actual or ambient use is 28 to 32 degrees centigrade. For pH, the tolerance should be 6.5 and 8.5. It can be 6 to 8. But the permissible range mostly is also 6.5 and 8.5. There is a slight difference between tolerance and permissible limits. Okay, tolerance limit are the maximum ranges, but permissible means if it is permissible up to this value, the most of the standard functions or the stable state functions are preserved, or the ambient state functions are preserved for this water. So here the TDS, if you see, the tolerance level is 500 milligrams per liter. After that, it cannot be effectively used. But permissible use can go up to 2000 if we can bring down the TDS through some sort of treatment. Also, nitrates, if you see, tolerance is up to only 45 milligrams per liter. But permissible is up to 100 milligrams per liter. And phosphates, there is no permissible. The tolerance should be less than 2 ideally, or 2 to 5 milligrams per liter ideally in the water. So going to the biological parameters, I already talked about the most probable number and the coliforms, but bioindicators such as large insects and animals, these live in water. They are also indicative of its water quality. So the bacterial wise indicators are E. coli and coliform bacteria, and indicators they can indicate from a given location. If we have indicator organism and we study them, they will say whether there is what is the change that is happening to the ecosystem. So there are different boundaries: temperature boundary, oxygen boundary, nutrient boundary. These are the 3 important boundaries we have to consider. We saw this in terms of chemistry earlier. We saw this in terms of tolerance and permissible limits. But in a natural situation, these actual values correspond to some sort of boundary values. So the presence of a thermocline, that is indicated through the presence or the absence of a thermal boundary. That means the temperature range of the water. The presence of a hypoxic layer, which means that there is an oxygen boundary. If there is a fall below that, the area is designated as a hypoxic area. Okay, or anoxic area is total absence of oxygen. If, for example, the buildup of nutrients has increased over a period of time, it's what denotes a eutrophication layer or a nutrition boundary. So also, if suddenly in an area some previously organisms which have not been previously recorded make their presence, it means that the water quality has undergone a massive change. Also, decline or mass migration of animals, the toxic habitats setting in, and changes in habitats, these are all indicative of the changes in the water quality. And finally, we should understand that these are all indicators and they provide very important clues to the problems, in situ problems in a given water ecosystem. So when we have to monitor, our monitoring efforts should correspond to physical, chemical, and biological parameters to get a holistic view of how the water quality changes have been affected at a given point in time. So the bacterial E. coli that I said, there are two types of coliforms. One is known as fecal coliform and another are known as general coliforms. So here you see a picture of a petri dish where both are actually cultured in the laboratory under different nutrient concentrations. The nutrients are given and there is actually a substratum which is created for them, and they are grown and detected in their numbers. So first of all, a sample from the water bodies is collected and that is taken and transported to the lab. After filtration and initial screening, it is allowed to a minimum settling and it is added to a gel base called an agar plate. So the plate is incubated at certain temperature ranges for 24 to 48 hours. And when the time is given for the growth of the bacterial colonies. So colonies can be of fecal coliform colony or general coliform colony. And these are counted, like I said, in terms of the most probable numbers. So to summarize, first there is in situ sample collection happening at a place to detect and monitor water quality changes. The in situ analysis are also followed by recording observations at the site of observation. Then the samples are transported to the laboratory and parameters for nutrients are analyzed. The analysis of the data sets that reveal certain changes in the water quality statuses over time. So those can be analyzed statistically, empirically, or spatially, and the outputs are put together from across different databases for final inferences on how the water quality changes have been observed or created over a period in time. So coming to actually how do we visualize all this in terms of water management? In one part we have data on water distribution. Another part we have data on water abstraction or use or competitive use. And another way we have the change in the water quality in terms of pollution or the status of from change from the ambient statuses. So how do we put this in terms of, how do we put all this together? This is an example of a report, a technical report, which took all these factors into consideration and found out what are known as optimal water management strategies or 5 R's. Okay, first you can see, considering, for example, Bangalore city. So there is a particular area for the city which has been considered and there is a population. Bangalore receives an annual rainfall of say 770 millimeters and there is overland flow from this city into the river or the into the lake systems in this city. See there you can see that there is a rainwater yield of about 14 TMC per year. Okay, we have this estimate. Now there are lakes which capture this. There are watersheds that capture this rainwater and the flow which comes due to the rain. This is captured and it corresponds to a total, contributes to the total water availability for the city of the order of 30.85 TMC per year. See, the rainwater is about 15 TMC and the water availability is about twice that. So there is some other source we can understand which corresponds, which contributes to the rest of the water availability. What could that be? The sewage that is generated from the domestic sector that is treated, recycled and treated and that contributes to about 16 TMC. So now we know that about 14.8 plus another 16 TMC, that corresponds to about 30.85 TMC. From this water that is totally available to the city, there is a demand from the domestic sector of about 20 TMC. So now how do we, reconcile this? Out of a water availability of 30.85, 20.85 is taken away only by domestic sector, right? So the increase in population, if we have to supply water to the increasing population, that means we have to account for population growth also, and over time we have to apportion or proportionately have water partitioning or provisioning done to, so that the water availability is somewhat maintained to its ambient status. So in this way, how can we do that? First way is to increase the storage capacities. So we have to enforce storage capacity increases of rainwater, and also we have to enforce that there should be sustained release as per the demand, and so that loss of water is minimized over time. The second way we can do it is to improve the treatment technologies so that we can increase the freshwater recovery. So that will add to the total water availability for a city. The 5 R's: rejuvenate, retain, recycle, reuse, and responsible use. The 5 R's can contribute to how effectively the water ecosystem services in a city can be used. So I'm showing this as an example which combines all the ideas that we have been discussing so far in one way, in also balancing how the human benefits, apart from availability flow to human benefits part, is reconciled. So there are different ways in which we impact the water, and water is also a legislative subject. So in India, we have what is known as the Indian Water Act, which supposedly helps us to preserve how the use of water is subjected to across different population, across different geographic areas, which is governed by the law of the land. So what came about to preserve the water quality and to conserve water resources, as well as the management of water resources, was in terms of Water Prevention and Control of Prevention Act of India and the amendments in 1978. So I'm not going into details of these Water Act, but I would like to tell you that this looks at water pollution as a very, very important or a serious issue, and the act governs how there is the way to monitor and analyze the water and also reuse and redistribute water. If the human offenders are found to be guilty of changing the water quality over time, this Water Pollution Act gives us the power to control such activities. So competitive use, as an example, I would like to show 3 lake ecosystems. If we consider 3 lake ecosystems of different water quality, different water storages, and different capacities, we can see that the lake 1, which has a very high green to blue to green ratio. Blue means water spread, and green ratio is the amount of greenery covering the lake, okay, or the land use characteristic. It has a very high ratio, but has very low production. Okay, so you can see there is a boat there. Probably it can have a recreational use if it is of a low pollution, and without management we can use this. But of course it also have low economic value as far as its food partitioning profile is concerned. It can have a medium to high socio-cultural value and have low anthropogenic impacts. This is a very nice profile of a lake ecosystem which has competitive uses in terms of recreational use, as in also in terms of maybe a consumptive use. But lake number 2, if you see, even though it is low pollution and a low management, it has more economic value because of the presence of maybe more rich, it supports a higher fishery in this lake. Okay, so but if the amount of anthropogenic impacts are of moderate to medium value, which does not escalate over time, the ecosystem services of this particular lake can be preserved over time. And like Lake 1 it can be sustainably used for its fishery production or fishery value. So in that ways, the ecosystem services contribute more to fisheries in Lake 2. But Lake 3, if you see, because of high pollution and excessive entry of pollutants, there is very high primary production and high eutrophication. So in that ways, there is very low socio-cultural value. You can see that the outlets there are dumping industrial waste probably. And the anthropogenic impacts are very high, which means that this needs excessive management over time, and the benefit aspect of this particular ecosystem is very, very low, but the costs are very high for maintenance. So the total ecosystem services value is low in this case. Each of these lakes in their own ways face some qualitative changes, but these have to be overcome if competitive use versus competitive use in the face of their lake water quality is to be preserved. So with this example, I conclude today's class. I hope I gave a good overview of competitive use versus water quality characteristics, and you can come back to me if you have any questions.